righty. Hello and welcome to vBrownBag, the weekly IT learning video podcast where we bring you experts in the wide world of technology to talk about their favorite topics. It's a show and tell for tech geeks. Tonight's presentation is fun Terraform stuff with Kalen Arndt. Hi, Kalen. How you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. So we're going to get some quick housekeeping items out the way really fast, right? Before we start to get into the conversation. During the webinar, I'm the only host today, but I will do my best to monitor the questions in the thread for the live audience members. And of course, anyone that's tweeting vBrownBag or hashtag vBrownBag, we'll try and monitor those threads as well as best as possible. So with that, I'll stop sharing. And
all right,
get to ask Kalen to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about yourself, Kalen.
Oh, you got it, buddy. So, first off, let me go to slideshow mode here. Check this out. Look, I did it.
Ooh.
So, I'm Kalen Arndt. I'm a staff solutions engineer at HashiCorp, and primarily what I end up doing is I work with partners like this large solutions integrators globally. And what I end up doing is I actually take all of HashiCorp's products and I integrate it in with what they're actually doing and what they're implementing at customers to help drive like a full stack type of solution. Prior to this, I did a lot of VMware. So I was at VMware for a year, and then I ran a VMware practice for like, what was it, Roger? Like 7 years?
Something like that. Close to 7 years. Yes, right.
Yep. And then I was at VMware before that for 4 years. So I pretty much just did VMware until COVID hit, and then I said, why not change everything? So that's essentially what I do now. So the first thing that I kind of want to talk about, and of course, you know, I messed up the slide order, and it was my one job. But you know what? I'm going to change it right now. Watch this. Whoa. All right. Pretend you didn't see it.
Didn't see it whatsoever.
Very
Our
cool.
Studio audience will ask them to close their eyes for a quick moment.
So I'm gonna be shifting back and forth in the presentation and kind of my editor, right? So the biggest thing that I kind of want to start with is just general styling for Terraform. I write a lot of Terraform at HashiCorp. I write a lot of modules. And so what I end up doing is I see a lot of people's modules, and I'm sorry for the flashbang that just kind of came in, but I see a lot of different ways that people write Terraform code. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just everything's in a different format because a lot of things make sense to a lot of different people. And primarily what I'm talking about is like the individual files of each individual TF file. So some people break this out into each resource has its own file. Some of it's kind of generalized, maybe just network.tf, things like that. But I kind of want to take a step back because HashiCorp really doesn't have like an enforced style. And this is by no means their opinion, just mine as someone who writes a lot of it. Disclaimer. But realistically, your code should kind of tell a story, right? So the format should be like the introduction. It should have a glossary, an index, and it should be that if you have long chapters or large amounts of code, you need to break it up so that it's digestible, reusable, and it's referenceable. And that's typically the path that a lot of people take. They over break things up, if that's a way to say that. And where they put everything in so many different files, and then it's hard for other people that are coming in to look at that code to really understand what's actually happening and what it's doing. And so this isn't a strict requirement. I'm not your dad, but this is how I write all of my Terraform. So really it comes down to 5 files. That's it. If you want it, if something gets absolutely insane, it might go 6 files. But the main.tf should really contain all of your resources, your data sources, your locals, and your module calls if you're nesting modules. Generally, what ends up happening is locals reside at the top, then any data sources should be near any of the resources that are referencing them. And then when I build these things, I try to almost think of it in an approach where, what would this look like if I had to do this manually? If I had to click ops my way through this, what would my steps be? And if I'm looking at those actual resources themselves, if I'm reading top to bottom, that's kind of the graph or the path that Terraform is taking to get the end result, right? And then we kind of look at variables, kind of self-explanatory, all the variables in alphabetical order with the required variables up at the top. So a lot of the times I'll see people just throw variables in a variables file, nothing wrong with it. However, if I need to determine what is required, and maybe they don't use that great project called TF-Docs, I have to either go through the variables or do a Terraform plan and see what it comes back with in like the interactive mode. So that's what I try to at least separate. So if someone wants to just quickly glance, they're going to know immediately this is required. The rest of these are optional or defaulted with same defaults. Then it's going to be outputs.tf. Again, alphabetical order. This is where all the outputs that are going to be referenced via the module are placed. And then, so this one apparently is pretty not normal, I guess. So like this versions.tf was really something that was in place when you did a Terraform upgrade, or I think in like the previous versions. I started way past this, but to me this made sense of, I have a file that literally only contains the required provider versions, the backends that I'm referencing, the required versions of Terraform. It does not contain the individual authentication methods or modifications for the providers. It is literally just a place for me to go, what versions are required and what experiments are enabled and what backends am I using? That's how I use it. And that's how I maintain it in modules.
So your authentications, then are you putting those in main.tf, or are you?
The last one, and that would be providers.tf.
Providers?
So for me, I use providers.tf. Again, I've seen people collapse versions and providers into one thing. The only reason that I kind of separate them out like this is that generally we don't recommend having a providers file inside of your module, right? Unless you're doing like no code provisioning. So what we end up doing is with that versions.tf, if I look inside of that module, I see these are all the versions that are required via Terraform. And then in my root module, or the one that's actually calling that, maybe my module is building a VPC or something, the authentication is coming from that providers.tf in that root module. So this is generally how I go through and lay things out. And so this is typically what someone comes at me and says, well, what about this? I have a bunch of files, I separate them. At the end of the day, Terraform is going to take every single file that is represented in that directory during the run, and it is going to ingest it silently, right? And so really it's going to run and function the same way. And when I look at this, it's always who's coming in behind me and are they going to understand the way I think? Because to you, Roger, we could think of maybe you have a file that's creating a load balancer, right? Mm-hmm. But you have a data source that's looking up maybe the subnets or the VPC. Should that data source belong with the load balancer file? Should it go in the data.tf file, or does it belong with the VPC? Where does it go? Well, that depends on the person that's actively writing this, because that makes sense to them, right? And so people put things in different buckets in different ways. And so my entire thing is that when I come in and look at a lot of people's code, either when I'm helping do code reviews or I'm helping them with a lot of maybe refactoring, that's the first thing that we end up seeing. And some of the things that we end up kind of going through and saying, like, I have no idea. I'm jumping around trying to figure out what's being called and how it's being called, right? So it might make sense to you. It might not make sense to others. And realistically, if you're starting to think about, like, do I need to separate this out into something else, you always could potentially use a submodule. I'm not saying to do it, but it's something to also keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, yeah, just curious, how I've seen individuals write like their main.tf files and their lines of code are in the like thousands. And, I think to your point, it's not digestible because after you've read through about 300, you're like, okay, I'm going to have to map all this out on paper or something because it's just so much going on. And I've even seen people put their outputs inside their main.tf all the way towards like the bottom. So they don't really segregate everything. So what you're saying is separate it as much as you want and as you need to, as you can, and then put it in more digestible chunks.
Yeah, from like a reusable format, right? Like if I think about it, and I'll kind of go to my editor over here for a second. Wrong screen, this one. So if I look at,
we're gonna have to zoom in a little bit on that one.
I'm gonna. Don't you worry. All right, all right. All right. There we go. So this is just I went and grabbed a random. A random repo, right?
Okay, don't show us anything confidential, unless you really want to. But
no, I modified it, right? So like, if someone's using the Terraform language server, they're going to have things in here that have like references that are highlighted. So if I see like what's referencing this resource, I can go, oh, okay. Well, this security group in this lb.tf file is actually being referenced by this object here. So it makes it relatively easy for me to kind of shift around. But if someone doesn't have this, or for some reason their language server is losing its mind because you have thousands of folders open, I've done that. It's very confusing. So like this is an example of I pulled from someone's repo where they have the security group rules for the load balancer with the actual load balancer resource inside the load balancer file. Right. But they also have a security group rule that allows all egress outside in the security group file. So realistically, should that go into security groups? Should that sit with the load balancer? Or if I'm doing a data lookup to determine the VPC, does it sit within this data folder or does it sit somewhere else? And these are the type of things when I'm looking at this, I'm jumping back and forth, trying to figure out what's declared, how it's declared, and if it works. And these are the things that's why I always recommend like start with the main.tf. If it starts to grow, think about what your overall solution is. If your intent is to build, let's say you're building out, let's say secrets inside of AWS with AWS Secrets Manager. You might need KMS keys to encrypt and decrypt those secrets. Do you also then want to place all of those KMS resources inside that main.tf? No. And with that, you're also going to need IAM permissions, right?
Right.
So then IAM is also going to go in there. And then you have to kind of think this module or this Terraform code that I'm writing in its entirety. Is this growing too large? And do I segment this out? So maybe in the future, I could say, hey, actually, you know what I want to do? I kind of just want a module that builds me a ton of secrets. And then I want another module that gives me the ARNs of those secrets. And that's my IAM module and says, I'm going to loop through all of those and say, here's your permissions, good customer, good internal person. Go forth and prosper. I reference the output from my secrets module. And it's an input to my IAM module.
Right.
So that's what I typically take a step back because I have files that will grow drastically. And I kind of say, do I need to break this up to be more generalized or is this my desired goal? And will I be able to use this in the future? And that's why when I say you need to break it up in the chapters, that's how I typically think about it. So.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, I like that better anyway. I think it's always better to have it more digestible and keep things that are a little bit more sensible together. Like, as you were saying, security groups. Why have security groups in main and then have security groups in another file to call security groups? Why not just call that security group's TF, have it all in that TF file, that security group's TF file, and then reference it that way instead.
Right. And like when you do other languages, typically people end up breaking it up. So it's almost a little bit different for at least Terraform, I would say. So typical directory structure of a module, right? This is the pattern that I follow. So the folders themselves are pretty self-explanatory. If I have submodules that I'm using, let's say I have a module that might be, I don't know, adding profiles to a database or some configuration parameters to a database that I'm actually building in the calling module, I might bundle that in a subfolder called modules. The examples folder is kind of it is a standard for when you actually go through and import modules into the registry. Anything that's below that examples folder is actually populated inside the Terraform registry. The tests folder, I've been using this a little bit more lately, especially with Terraform test. And generally, any tests that I'm executing would come from there, not necessarily examples, although I have seen people leverage the examples as tests. I know Rosemary has a very strong opinion about a lot of this in the previous vBrownBags about like how you structure tests and things like that. So I can,
absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I generally kind of fall into this tests folder for everything. The files folder, it's generally just for like MISC things that I need to actually upload or if I need to modify a reference. And then realistically, the most thing that I use a lot of the time besides modules and examples and tests is templates. A lot of the time when I'm doing like Cloud Init, or if I'm using Helm or any of the Kubernetes providers, I'm generally templating YAML, which is it's interesting, but that's generally where I end up either bundling the templates with the module, or I give the user the ability to supply their own template. And you have to be kind of careful with like a templates folder, like a files folder, because users are not able to change those templates, files or folders, because they might not have rights in the repository. And in order for them to actually do like a modification to those files, you might have to then create a new release of the module. So you always kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of doing this. Especially like if your application is fairly dynamic and the configurations change rather rapidly. So, specifying versions. This is really something that I think a lot of people already do. However, think about what you're setting as far as the minimum versions. When you're referencing providers, your modules, you always want to have something pinned. If you're using like GitHub, you want to use like ref tags for your releases. If that's something you're okay with doing, you might not just want to point it to main. You want to specifically reference a release. When you're looking at things like modules and you're using the Terraform registry or a private registry, you can use this pessimistic constraint operator here, which is this tilde.
The tilde.
That essentially keeps your modules from upgrading to a major version. So if you're using like Anton makes awesome modules for AWS, right? And so we might release a new provider update. Let's say the AWS provider goes from 4 to 5. Generally, there's breaking changes when something like that occurs. And so most module maintainers will then also increment that to the latest release. A lot of people use greater than, equal to, and then just put it in a version because they just kind of don't care. They just don't want to deal with the versioning. That's how bad things happen. There's a lot of people I've seen that just say, whatever, anything past like .1, I don't care. And then a major release comes out and everything breaks and they have no idea why until they go back and start looking at, oh my God, I didn't pin these. So this is something where you always want to kind of keep that in mind.
Right. And there's a lot of syntactical changes too, going from one version to another, right? Because I noticed when I was doing Terraform a couple of years back, and I had some old code, and I went back and was using that old code, and I mean that old code I actually had it hard coded for a particular version, which of course newer version was available, and when I updated to a newer version, it broke everything. So I ended up going through and changing syntax, and like some of the squiggly brackets weren't used anymore for interpolation. So it was just like, oh, okay, yeah, I've got to make some changes here, right? All right, but it was kind of fun.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if you so if you don't specify the minimum version, you're automatically going to automatically going to download the latest version regardless, right? Including the latest plugins.
So if you're using, it's funny, I don't actually not set the version. It's been so long since I've actually tried. I think you're actually able to. I think it pulls the latest release, regardless. And for modules, if you just set, like, if you're using Git and you just put in like a URL for the GitHub repository, it's just pulling the latest from main every single time. It uses the default branch, which is whatever I assigned to the repo. Okay. So the greater than or equals to, this is where you're going to have a bad time. The reference to the actual individual tags in the bottom right versus, like the pessimistic constraint operator up there, saying that like version 2.x is fine for me. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. So with dynamic Terraform, this is one of those things where people always want to use dynamic immediately, which is great until you have to have someone that goes through and reads it, right? So dynamic loops and counts and things like that are very great for reducing the amount of copy and paste code. I remember when I was first learning Terraform when I was at VMware, I literally every network I did for NSX, I would just paste a new network every single time, even though the only thing I was changing is I think I was changing the name of the segment, and then the subnet. So when I started to learn for loops, I was like, oh my God, this is great. I have this one thing, and then it just builds out 1,000 things if I really wanted to. However, if you have people that are looking at it that don't understand for each or count, they are going to have issues reading it. So if you're using like very complex dynamic statements, not necessarily like just generic for each, but like if you're reconstructing maps or something, use comments if you can. The biggest issue that I generally see is I'll have someone's locals where they'll do something like, so if I go into this working folder, and this is, so I'm going to do what I said. I'm going to make the locals block, which is going to do this as an example. So what I'll have someone do is they'll do this. They'll say like 4K comma V in var dot, X, K V if, and then so like the problem is, I mean, like this is great if you're writing Golang. However, we're not you're not being charged per character, right? Like for you to actually come in here, and this broke my brain when I was trying to learn Terraform, because I came from like PowerShell, like general scripting languages when I was working on VMware stuff. Like if you were to just say like parameter value, that's a little bit more self-explanatory to maybe someone that is kind of coming at this in a newer way. Or if there are specific things you're trying to pull out of a map or pull out of whatever data you're manipulating, describe it. Like for, I don't know, DB entry in this, like you need to have something semi-descriptive in there. I realize it's kind of annoying, and you look way cooler if you just kind of do this.
Yeah,
but it's hard for newer people to kind of read it, and it's also hard for just new people kind of just, if they're just coming into your code, to determine what's going on. There's a great VS Code add-on called Better Comments, where if you're doing things like you can have like specific alerts or just notations, or if you have like questions, like you can just do things like this, so it actually calls things out in a little bit more colorful manner. It helps me because I write a lot of locals. And so like if I have to ask Sean a question as to like why AWS does AWS things, I'll use something like this and then say follow up with so and so to determine why. So just keep that in mind. I did that a lot I was like, I got the for each down now in locals. I'm reconstructing maps. I'm using K comma V. And one of my friends, Ben Thomas, who actually taught me Terraform, um, he's the one who said, they're not charging you per character. Like, make it something that's descriptive. And I was like, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense, because everyone else's stuff that I read, I was like, I have no idea what's going on. The other thing that I also see a lot of people doing, use count as a switch. It's awesome. I use it all the time for just conditional enabling or disabling specific resources. So let's say that I have a module that's semi-generic, that's deploying secrets for, I don't know, console. If I can use count to say count equals var.console true, and then it'll execute, or 0. Or if it's false, it will not. So it allows you to kind of group things together for more of a generalized function, but also have almost like those one-off resources or different toggles for you to maybe generate additional resources or modify things. So that's typically something that I end up seeing. So
Good,
right.
good.
So, wow, look at that. Comments, but not with my super fun extension. So other things, you would be surprised at how many people do not use Terraform format.
No,
So,
stop it. Serious?
Terraform format is great. I love it. Remember it, use it. It's a blessing. There is, I think, in the extension in VS Code, when you save, it'll auto format. I don't really use that because I use pre-commits, but that's something that'll kind of get you in the habit of formatting your Terraform every single time that you save, because it'll actually go through, ensure that all the equal signs are lined up. It will make sure that like you're using spaces instead of tabs. And then when you're kind of looking at just generalized like resource implementation, I think earlier when I had this VS Code window open and I was using the example here, you can see that like, I'm just looking up the current region in AWS. It's not configured like this.
Right.
There's no inputs for it. It doesn't need to be multiple lines. All we need is for this to be on a single line. Just general things like that when you're writing Terraform. So these are some of the things that I try to remind people, because the amount, just really Terraform format, the amount of things I see that aren't formatted is kind of crazy.
And me, I jump around from different files to files. So and then, but my favorite command is actually the Terraform FMT -recursive. So so I don't pay attention to any of the formatting while I'm coding, and then when I'm done, recursive, let it go. It just goes through and does all those, all the modules, and then all the sub modules as well.
Yeah, and like the biggest thing, so like I have way too many Terraform aliases. I'm more than happy to share them. I think mine for that is like TFFR. I even like half the commands. I told myself I was not going to use aliases until I got the associate, and then after I got the associate, I was just like, what? And then I immediately like just dumped all my aliases in there, and it's like my favorite thing ever. So, yeah, format is your best friend. So is Terraform console, and I'll kind of go into that a little bit later with like some hands-on stuff. It's one of my favorite things that not a lot of people use, and I think like if you look at any course, like whether like mostly on like the like Udemy or any of the other sites, a lot of people go, "Hey, Terraform console is this thing that exists," and then after that they just go next, and then they kind of skip over it. If you're writing complex for loops or anything, I have problems like visualizing it in my head, and with console, you can actually kind of like go in and type things out and then check your logic in the command line instead of just going, okay, I don't know, it just didn't work. I hit apply and it just gave me this weird error. So it's like the one thing that I use a ton. So,
and I used it recently too, for the slice command, right? Yep. Terraform slice, and because while I was reading the documentation, I couldn't understand how they came up with the result that they were coming up with. So I started typing it in and Terraform console slice, and then put in all the options. And I was like, oh, okay, now I get it.
Right.
But it's a great place to be able to test things and just, like you said, test the logic out just without having to go into code it and then hit apply and then go for the result.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I love it. Anyway, so flat modules.
We're geeking out here.
Yeah, right. So flat modules. Always try to use flat modules, meaning that you have your root module, essentially where you're calling whatever modules you're using from the registry. The biggest problem, and I've been dabbling with some nested modules, and it's difficult. It's hard to troubleshoot. So from like a flat module structure, this is typically what I end up recommending. And so if you're sitting there going, well, I could just fit more stuff in this module, we're going to go back to the original thing that I talked about before, was just writing generic Terraform. Modules are essentially chapters. They have their own story arc. They exist to do a specific thing, and that's it. They should not be gargantuan, just chunks that do 1,000 different things in one call. You have the ability to break them up. There is additional overhead of maintaining them, but it kind of keeps it keeps it easier to kind of deal with. So if we look at like if we kind of look at like what's just right for you, generally for me, it's going to end up being the module that you are calling, should it have, and this is like something general, it should be like 5 times longer than the actual like root module that's calling it, right? Because like if you're just, and so I've actually seen people overdo this, where they have actually made a module per resource. And I was like, this is interesting, right? Because like, I've never thought of that. But the thing is, you have like thousands, let's say you have GCP, like the actual GCP provider, and you have so many resources in that thing. And think about like one resource is one module. So I've seen people literally take one input, that they might loop it, and they have like one output, and then they have hundreds of modules to maintain. That exists. And there are also people that will group so many things together that when you have to do maintenance or modify like literally anything, you're impacting gargantuan amounts of infrastructure. When you start looking at modules that are like this big with this many objects inside of them, you also have to kind of consider blast radius, right? Because like if someone came in, they're using your great, Swiss Army knife module, and let's say they're deploying their entire infrastructure with it, one destroy on that module call, what ends up happening?
Or is everything?
Yeah, right. So I kind of think of it like, is this self-contained? Am I going to reuse this, and how am I going to do it? So I got ahead of myself.
well, let me ask you this really quick.
Yeah.
So for the individuals who write a module per resource, right? Is it that maybe they want to be able to use it in other code that they're going to write eventually later on, so they can say, hey, you know what? We've got a repository for every single resource out there, and we can take it and add it to some like reusable code for something else.
Yeah, but I mean, so if you think about that, right? Like you could do that, but why? Like you could just have those resources in there where maybe it's I'm spinning up an IAM policy and some keys or something. Do I need to have an individual resource that's also a module that I have to also maintain in a life cycle and say like, okay, provider changes. I need to now modify my version constraints. I need to cut a new release. I need to modify absolutely everything. And then it's like, well, I could do that. I mean, but that's a ton of work. And I don't know what the value would be of doing that, because realistically, you're adding another line to an existing resource if it makes sense. That's not something I see fairly often. I just want to say I don't see it fairly often. I've seen it like maybe 2 or 3 times, and I've been at Hashi, I think like almost 2.5 years. Generally, people kind of take the encapsulated like chapter type of approach. So, but But every time that I get too deep and I'm like, oh man, it'd be great, I could add this thing in there, and then it could also, and I'm like, I'm adding stuff. I will sit there and I'll take a step back and say, like, should I be doing this, or does it make sense to decouple it? So it's more reusable for that type of targeted approach. So these are the typical considerations that I would have when creating modules. And so where should a module live? So you got a couple options here, right? So submodules, going back to what we had before, that modules folder that existed, those would essentially be packaged with your module when you're doing a call. So think of it like, I think, you know what, I can actually show you an example of this. Nope, not that one. I have so many windows open. You'd think I would have thought of this before.
No, mate, you know what? This is new. This is brand new stuff right here.
That's right. So Terraform registry. Huzzah. All right, so let's look for the AWS providers right here. So I believe Anton has submodules. So you can see right here, this is in the public registry. And Anton has a submodule called VPC endpoints. And this is very specific. So when he builds a VPC, you typically want to have some endpoints to access those services. And so he bundles this submodule with his VPC module. It makes sense. And now it's not another entry inside of the registry. It's versioned and maintained with the VPC module in and of itself. So that's one approach. And typically this makes sense for a lot of approaches, depending on like how you want to segment things out. Maybe I'm building a database and I need a submodule that just builds my parameters, my parameter groups, right? So that's one thing that you can kind of think of. Think of it as a bundled module with a module. Another thing is that like you could use a private registry. Same thing as you think of like the public registry that we just showed. Private registry in things like Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise. Even I think GitLab has a private registry too. What you can end up doing is you can end up pulling those modules. They aren't public, but it allows you to use that semantic versioning we kind of touched on before, the greater than or equal to sign, or using that pessimistic constraint operator to keep it from going to major releases. But that's generally where you'd end up publishing those. You see this in most enterprise organizations where they have a private registry. So that way they can kind of control, maintain, or they sync the public modules and they modify them there. Right. Then you also have the Git modules. Go ahead.
You need like Terraform Cloud or something like that, or Terraform Enterprise for a private registry. Is that correct? Or
yeah, so you can use Terraform Cloud, Terraform Enterprise. There's also I think GitLab has a private registry. I don't know of other. I'm sure there's other open source projects out there that act as a private registry. Okay. And then you kind of have to configure Terraform to connect and utilize those registries. But it allows you to not publish your code publicly, but also leverage those kind of looser versioning constraints that we talked about before.
Okay, good.
So you could use Git modules. We talked about that before with the versioning with tags, where I had that ref equals v1.0.0. That's fine. However, you're not going to get that semantic. You're not going to get the semantic versioning where you're allowing you to upgrade past specific releases or maintain minor releases. Right? You're kind of pinning it specifically to that one release for that tag. A way around this is, I guess, you could reference a branch specifically where you're doing upgrades or mainline updates. That's also terrifying. So generally, I see people just use tags or just use the public registry. I mean, I use the public registry an absolute insane amount. So that's another option. And I also think the private registry, I don't actually know. The private registry might be in Terraform Cloud in like the free tier or whatever the current tier is when you sign up. Okay. So, all right. So when we kind of look at the Git repository structure, again, this goes back to how should you structure your actual modules when you're building something to either publish publicly or you're using it internally. What I typically end up doing is one module per repository. And unless like you have a sub module. I guess technically that's like 2 modules in a repository, but really it's 1, I guess. The other thing too is that the Terraform registry requires a very specific naming standard. It has to start with Terraform, a hyphen, and then the provider you're using with that module. It's dealer's choice on that one. So let's say that you have a module that's maybe contacting AWS and maybe also interacting with HashiCorp Vault. You could label it as Terraform-AWS-Vault-something. It's going to import under the AWS provider. So this is one of those things where I generally err on the side of caution and say, how many resources am I building per provider? And if one is higher than the other, that's the provider that I build it with, or I import it with, or I name the repo after. So again, deeply nested modules, and I'll kind of talk about why that's not a great time. We want to avoid those, but nested modules, kind of like how we looked at Anton's module, where the nested VPC endpoint modules included as a part of the VPC module. So I think lastly, getting close to there. So when you're thinking about like module design, think about maybe not embedding its dependencies inside of the actual module in and of itself. What I mean by that is that like, let's say that you're trying to deploy like an EC2 instance on AWS or just any compute instance on any cloud. The issue that some people will do is they'll build this module to be like the push button get banana, to coin, steal something from Joe Weber, where you end up going through and you're saying like, okay, well, in order for me to build this one compute instance, I'm going to build a VPC. I'm going to build security groups. I'm going to build an S3 bucket for some reason because I'm going to use it. I'm also going to build all of these other things just to get that instance going. And the issue is that for me to then consume that in a generalized manner and kind of like a pluggable infrastructure or a composable infrastructure, I guess, that's not going to work, because for me to do all of those things, I have to build all those things that kind of don't matter. Right? I only care about that compute, right? So what should be happening there is that you should be building what you care about and then taking those dependencies as inputs, right? So what's my VPC ID? What subnet do you want me to go on? Maybe what security group do you want me to be a member of? Or maybe you build the security group as a part of that compute instance. Maybe those are 2 things that are kind of loosely coupled. And those are the types of things that you kind of have to keep into consideration. Because when you're looking at it from like your very specific viewpoint of like, this does everything for me, it works. But it's the second you take that out and try to apply it in a more generalized manner to a wide range of infrastructure, it starts to crack and crumble a little bit, right? So this allows us to reuse, and recycle. So nested modules.
Here we go.
All right, so this is essentially a nested module structure. So the root module, which is generally where Terraform is running, is calling this module called console cluster, and then the console cluster module is saying, well, you know what? I need to build a VNet inside of Azure. I also need to build some servers. So I'm going to call these other 2 modules, and then those modules call other modules. And so then you think about this. Where does it break? And how do I fix it? And the issue then becomes, how am I taking the data out of like the let's say the VNet module all the way over there on the right? If I need an output from that, I have to declare the output 3 times.
Yes.
I have to declare the variable inputs for this 3 times, because you can see like name, right? So where does it break? How does it work? And then also every time we're initializing this, we're also like having to download all these modules. So like I generally caution people, 3 deep is about as deep as you go. After that, it's just hard to kind of keep track of, and maybe at least for me to actually get data out, or for me to maintain a lot of these. Because like, think about it, like if that console VNet module, let's say that someone upgrades, I then have to cut a new release for the cluster module. And then I have to then change the version for the source in my root module just because of one update. And so those are things to keep in mind when you're nesting things like this. Don't go too deep. It's like this like gentle balance of like, what should I do without impacting a ton of things. So I think this has a cool animation. That was it. Whoa! All right, so
that was so cool.
I mean, right? So
if you blinked, you would have missed it.
I mean, yeah. You know what? I'm not always flashy. All right, just flash banging, and that's about it. So, so when you think about the actual module composition, based on the last things that we did, right? So they weren't really giving us any value. Realistically, if we're using kind of this more flat composition, we are able to, call the same modules, but then take the outputs of each module and reference it. So in the green icons there, you can see that, we're taking the VNet ID from the VNet module, and then we're reusing it in the other subsequent module calls. So it reduces the amount of variables you have to then declare, consume, and then it also allows for the graph. I think the graph is still going to form okay, but the graph isn't going to look as bad as it would with all of those nested modules. So, yeah, essentially, this allows us to kind of go through and do things like this. So
you're doing a couple of data calls here, right, as well for your VNet IDs, right? Yep.
And so I can just make one data call, and then I can reference that data object as an input for these other module calls, instead of me having to then say like, okay, well, this is an input for the console SG, which actually is an input for the consoles. Like, it's just a lot of things to do. So. All right. Is that my last slide? I think it is. I didn't even put an end thing on there. So I saw a question from the Terraform docs. What would I suggest for learning? So this is not an endorsement in any shape or form. However, there are 2 courses that I have taken on, I always feel bad because I always say this wrong, Udemy or Udemy, whichever one it is.
Udemy. Yep. Yes.
So there is one by a person named Zeal Vora. That is the Terraform course that I first took when I wanted to learn Terraform. I also took Brian Krausen's course. Both are great. Those give you enough information to kind of get started. And then from there, it's kind of branching out. And the biggest thing for me, like the takeaway, and I was talking to Roger about this before we started, is that when I took those courses, took the test, I knew enough to know that I know nothing. Because like, when you think about it, like I have the ability to kind of automate a bunch of things. And a lot of the stuff, I think it kind of prepares you for the exam. But from like a high level, it just kind of lightly touches on like for each maybe module composition a little bit, but like in your day-to-day, as you write Terraform, you're going to build that skill set up a lot more. But that's where I started. So I think those would be my 2 recommendations. I think there's also a Terraform up and running book. I haven't read it, but that's another thing as well. So, all right. Hey, Roger, how much time do we have?
Oh, we have 10 more minutes, right? So yeah, you're gonna have to show us some demos.
I just yammer on a ton. All right, hold on a second. I'm gonna go in here to this module that I wrote for something else. All right, I'm gonna talk about this one thing that no one ever talks about. So let's say that you're writing something for AWS. I'm gonna use Secrets Manager because I have been all night. So let's say that I have a map of secrets. And this is like, we went from like 0 to like, here's a complex object map with a bunch of different types. So if you're looking at things like, I want to create many resources at once, or I want to, like modify a bunch of things in my infrastructure, you're going to end up using for each. However, when you're working with things like this, it might not be easy to kind of think about it, like, well, I guess visualize it in your head. So one of the things that I always do, and I always recommend, is I create a folder called local. And so if I build a resource, let's do this. So here's my AWS Secrets Manager secret. I'm going to call this, we'll just leave it an example. What we'll do is we'll do for each. We don't want that. We just want to do var.secret manager secrets. And then this will be each.value.name.
That name.
I think that has name in here, right? Let's double check. Yep, sure does.
Sure does.
All right. So what does that mean for us? Well, we have a bunch of things. So if I come in here, there's no defaults for these. Shame on me. We'll just do one of these. Actually, we'll just use the TFE ones for now. So with optional object maps, it allows you to specify like a default for each one of them. That's what this is.
Okay.
And then at the very bottom, the default here is just the empty map. And so what this ends up looking like, I'll show you in a second. If it works, demo gods be kind. Okay, so let me just open this. All right, I'm going to type it out. Terraform plan, also known as TFP. Oh no!
Hold on a second. Terraform plan first.
Yeah, I already edited this folder. I apologize. Okay. You know what? We're going to do it the correct way. We'll do one of these, and then I'll do a TFI, which is Terraform init. Thank you, Roger, for reminding me that is the correct steps to take. So I guess first off, what we'll do is TFC. So TFC stands for Terraform Console in my aliases. But if I do like var.secrets manager secrets, I can see that there is a bunch of stuff in here. This is what it actually looks like for me to deal with this. So the error that I got earlier, it's null. Well, we can't do stuff with null things because it's null. So how am I going to get myself out of this pickle? Well, that's where this local folder typically ends up coming in. So what I do is I create a main.tf file in here. And the general idea is I just copy over what is making my brain hurt. So we'll just take this and we'll put it here. And this is where I break the rule. All right. I will put variables in the main.tf only in the locals folder because no one ever sees it except for right now. And so how am I going to manipulate this map? How am I going to do something with it? I don't need to initialize because there's literally nothing in here. var.secrets manager secrets. Oh, I didn't put an S on there. Okay. So here's my map. So we see there's a bunch of null stuff in here. It's not great. So how do I fix it? Well, remember those 4 expressions I talked about earlier and locals?
Right.
For parameter, comma, value. Roger,
what, you don't want to use KV? No KV?
I can't. We're not being very cool now, are we? Parameter. So that's our key in this map, right? And we're going to assign that key to our value. So really, that just looks the same right now. However, we can use an if statement, right?
Yeah.
Well, how would we do that? Well, we could kind of go through and I don't know. Let's see. So if value here, these don't have values. Well, maybe they do. So value is not equal to null, right? We don't like null stuff. It's breaking us. Oh, man. Can you spot what's wrong with this?
It requires the in keyword.
Yeah.
After the name declaration.
Yeah. I messed it up. I'm missing it right here. var.secrets manager secrets. Okay, so you notice how this big old map we had here is now just this guy.
Right.
Okay, well, that's good for us. So, well, what if? So that works in my little local folder. I didn't have to kind of go through and muck up this entire thing. But how do I take this and apply it? So locals. So we'll call this my secrets because they're super secret. All right. All right. So for parameter value in var.secrets manager secrets parameter VRAMA every time. Okay. Well, all right. So now I need to reference this local. So let's just test it out.
That's
all right. Local.secrets. Now, Roger, I already initialized. Let's do a plan again. I double varred it.
Look at you.
It happens every time with autocomplete. Sean will back me up if you talk to him.
Live demo. I'm gonna have to get your aliases. I'm gonna have to steal your aliases from you.
I'll put them in a folder. I made a repo for this. So now we went from, hey, I have a general input map. Let's say that I have just a bunch of secrets I'm building. And that way, like, think of it like maybe this supports multiple lines of business or something. I can then take this map and say, well, maybe only certain people are going to fill out certain objects that I want them to. So what I can do is I can go through and just filter these null objects out. And that local folder is literally how I've taken things like this secrets manager-esque type of module and gone from just kind of that generic logic to things where I'm like literally going in and merging and dynamically generating a ton of secrets. And shame, I know my name. I didn't switch to the correct branch. But there are KVs in there because I wanted to look very cool and not take my own advice. So that locals folder is something that is not taught in like any course. It is something that is not generally coupled with like Terraform console and just being able to look at your input variables, your objects, how you can test out just generic functions like try or starts with or string contains or length. If there are things that you don't entirely know what's going to happen, you don't need to do like a plan, wait for the API. You can test it in your locals folder if you could just reconstruct the data. It's great. I love it. I'm happy to go through it any other time.
So really, locals is just a testing area for you, essentially.
Yeah, just that local folder is like a little playground whenever I'm writing Terraform. Is just to be like, you know what, this kind of seems funky and I had this weird idea. Let's try it. Like, for example, I wrote this like this my security group module, the one that like literally goes through and dynamically generates the source, the desk, the like all the like self rules, the cited rules, everything. And the only way that I could do this is I had all these objects and I had to then go through and take it and put it in a locals folder with my variables and see what happens. How can I reconstruct these maps? How can I do things like this? I did all with my locals folder because I'm using like a GitOps pipeline, or if I'm using Terraform Cloud or like at VCS integrated workflows. If I'm doing anything like this, I'd be like, all right, I'm going to commit it. There's an error. Cool. I have to come back here. And so that locals folder, if I know the structure of the data, if I know what the input is I'm going to be working with and I want to modify it, I absolutely can. If I want to dynamically merge values, whatever. And that's why I love this thing. And it's something that not a lot of people talk about because I don't think a lot of people really use Terraform console. And I absolutely love it. So be like, hey, keys. And then you just give it like var.secrets manager secrets. Like, it's great. I love it. I'm a fan. So anyway,
Now, I
use
know that in
this.
some of your code, you have comments, and in other pieces of your code, you don't have comments. And I know you
Yeah.
touched on it earlier where you put a comment and then maybe reference to somebody else or whatnot. But do you find that it's essential to comment out, like each individual resource or whatnot that you're writing about?
Um, so
Like right here you have like on the locals, you see
yeah,
that there's comments as you go down. So does that add to your story when you're taking
yeah,
things?
because like if I look at like this is like a monster local fun time because I'm dynamically generating secrets. I'm merging them if they're not provided. Like I'm doing all sorts of like I'm thinking of the Always Sunny in Philadelphia, like Charlie Kelly, like doing the Pepe Sylvia thing. If I'm doing stuff like this, if someone comes in and goes, what is this? The thing is I like in these locals, and I kind of touched on it before, I want to at least touch on something and say, like, this is just the map with the null stuff removed. This is my optional map if you're giving me something. And then this one just filters it if they did not give me data and the generate flag is true. And so these three maps feed everything else. So I try to at least put some of my comments above those to let people know that. And then like if it's something where it's one of these maps where it's just like, I'm going to go through and generate all of these things for a console or whatever. These things have to then be here because like if I looked at this, I'm going to have to like think of the maps that it's referencing, how it looks when it's merged, why I'm coalescing. Like there's all of these things in here that like the comments are going to help me. I know it's like 6 lines or something,
Right.
but it's going to help someone to come in and be like, oh, okay. So like there's things like that. But like if I'm looking at like secrets or anything else, I typically kind of keep these pretty normal. And unless I'm doing like advanced logic, I don't really comment these. That's just my normal approach for a lot of these. So I think locals get the most comments from me. Or like I've also seen people instead of doing this up here, I've seen people, and like this is something I also don't recommend, but I see a lot of people do it.
Do it right there inside the for each command.
Right.
Yeah.
So they take whatever's up here and they put it in the resource. And then you have to pretty much look through every resource. You're like, oh God, he's constructing something here. Okay, what does that do? And so if you're going to do things like this, always try to put it in the locals block at the top, at least so that way, if it's like, oh, it's a local, I know where that is, all the way up to the top, I can see it. And then maybe there's comments, maybe there's not, depending on how much the person likes you. And then there's stuff like that. So that's my soapbox. So yeah.
It's awesome. So learn Terraform console because it will help you greatly troubleshoot your code, and then of course put everything in a nice neat order when you're doing what is it, the flat architecture you're talking about, root modules underneath, right? I mean, there's a lot of great advice that you've given people here. From a security perspective, and this is kind of the last question before we head out. We know that when you're adding any sensitive information inside of Terraform, it gets copied into the state file. So you've got that's always there. But what are the ways that what are your favorite ways to basically either obfuscate sensitive information, right?
So if at all possible, always use environment variables. They do not show up. Okay, not all of them. Any of the ones that like the ones that say like TF underscore does show up in state. However, if there's like provider-based authentication, like AWS secret access key ID, that doesn't show up in state. So leverage those where possible. If you are, let's say you're putting a bunch of secrets inside of Secrets Manager because you like to live dangerously, that state should be protected, right? So practice RBAC, leverage things like Terraform Cloud, Terraform Enterprise, where you're using RBAC, it's encrypted in transit, encrypted at rest. You are controlling who has access to that state file. And then if you are not, let's say you're not using the systems, ensure that whatever state backend you're using has encryption.
Yeah.
Or pull secret. I mean, that's pretty much what I would say. I mean, there's other people that will argue that like you should encrypt state. That's fine, but then you have to pass that secret out to a bunch of other people, and then if you rotate that secret, then you have to give that secret to all those people. So it's still kind of the same. Like, what are you trading auth 0 for?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things where I always say, like, use an encrypted state backend, use something that has encryption in transit, and just be careful. Like, don't hard code things. Don't commit don't commit secrets to GitHub. Things like that. That's what I always try to do. I've done probably all of it. Like, I have committed secrets before I worked here when I was learning Terraform and Git in general. It's something I think literally everybody does, but at least it was in a private repo. But like, leverage things like Vault, leverage secrets managers, and leverage state encryption, like state backends, things like that.
Awesome. Great advice. Well, Kalen, thank you so much again for coming on vBrownBag. We want to thank our audience for showing up and for asking a few questions. And of course, we wish everybody a good night. Thank you again. Bye.